Welcome to the Ordinary Extraordinary Cemetery, where every death had a life and every life had a story. My name is Jennie Johnson, and I want to welcome you back to part 2 of Death and Dying 101 with Ryan Seidemann. If you missed the first part of this episode, be sure to check out last week's episode, number 248, for the beginning portion of our chat. So one of the questions was, does the public have any current ability to decide what happens with grave sites discovered in public locations? Happens all the time. I say this all the time. If not, have there been successful attempts to establish laws on behalf of the rights of the deceased?
So, does the public have any right to decide what happens when remains or cemetery or whatever is discovered in a public location? Well, they got a lot more authority in a public location than on a private one. Unfortunately, so many of these sites are found on private property. But even then, they don't have an awful lot of authority. At the federal level, there's almost nothing. The feds have largely left it to the states, with the exception of Native American remains and cemeteries, but only then if they're located on federal or tribal lands. The feds didn't try to reach further. Most of the states have. It's surprising to me some of the states that have not actually legislated to extend those protections to state property, local government property, and even private property. But in those schemes, there is absolutely a process for what happens to those spaces, what happens to the remains, what happens to the site. But I don't want to say 100% because then I'll be wrong, but in most circumstances, the decisions are not made by the public at large, and they're not made by the descendant community either. But whether to remove a cemetery, move a cemetery, what have you, the ultimate decision lies with the private landowner. And if it's in a public place, it relies with the public, with the government, subject to permits being issued now to do this in a professional scientific manner. And so, just again, I know Louisiana better than any place. If you were to run across, well, this does happen. I'll give you an example. After Hurricane Katrina, there was funding to extend streetcar lines a little further than they had gone, and so that real famous streetcar stop from Streetcar Named Desire, the cemetery's stop, was extended, and in the extension, they found remains. And come to find out, there's an entire cemetery lying underneath the road where they were building. And in that case, that's public property. Did the public have anything to do with what happened to those remains? No. But were they excavated professionally and reinterred in another cemetery? They absolutely were. The only place that our law in Louisiana gives any voice to a descendant community is in that final piece. Where do they go? And so in those cases, some states provide for a voice to the descendant community or to the public at large to suggest where remains that are encountered in development or whatever go. But in terms of whether to remove them in the first place or not, that is entirely a private landowner, public landowner, so the government, or a regulator decision.
Now, in this particular case, and I know this happens sometimes, and I see a lot of stories about, remains were discovered here because they're building. In most cases, it's because they're excavating land to build something, and then they discover the remains. And a lot of times it seems like these are lost cemeteries or lost burial grounds. Is there a way, does the government or whomever is going to be in charge of removing these remains, do they go in and even try to figure out who these people were? Or did they just say, we're just going to move them respectfully somewhere else? Like,
Yeah, most of those laws have minimum analysis standards. And so when those remains for that project were moved, matter of fact, one of my colleagues did the analysis on those remains to figure out who, what, why, where, and as much information as could be extracted without destroying any bone, so no
right.
destructive tests, no DNA, what have you, was done. And, it's kind of timely in that it's, we're on the just past the eve of the 20th anniversary of Katrina, but the same thing happened when the Katrina Memorial was built in New Orleans. It went in on top of a 19th century cemetery. And those people were disturbed some
Right.
for that memorial to go in. And those remains actually came to me, and I did that analysis because it was a good cause. So I did it for free, and they did get reburied in on the property.
Mm-hmm.
So most of the states do have a minimum standard analysis that should be done or has to be done, and whoever's doing the project has to pay for it. It's not on the taxpayers. Um, so the answer is yes. When that
Okay.
stuff happens today, that work gets done. Historically, not so much.
Mhm.
Right. I just so that there's record of it, and that
Mhm.
if somebody in the future figures out, hey, there was a cemetery here at one time, they can go back and say, yes, there was. We actually did remove those remains, and now they're
Yeah,
here. And there is some sort of record for somebody to follow up with. And then if they want to do something bigger with it in the future, they're able to,
yeah. There's
because
there's a long paper trail,
we know what
and
happened.
yeah. And so in this instance, I was talking about, it came from Charity Hospital's cemetery, one of the two of them, in the city. And you're absolutely right. The data collection was done, and the interpretation of how those people lived based on the analysis that was done is still going on. That's something we're
Wow.
actively working on here. We've had, I don't know, four or five scientific articles come out of that telling the story of these people. And when you were getting ready to building up to ask me that question, I was shaking my head like, no, no,
I
no,
saw
no.
that.
And it was because I thought you were going to ask me, is there some centralized database of where these cemeteries are? And the answer is no, no, no. And it's a shame, but it's just the reality of the way a lot of these things are. They're unmarked cemeteries, and they just get lost over time. And I say that from Louisiana's perspective, where we've got about four different running databases statewide that tries to capture this information, and none of them are complete. And I was just talking to folks in New Jersey last weekend, and they don't even have a place to start. And I was like,
Oh, wow.
oh, you poor people, you got a long way to go. Uh, because collectively, our databases here show 6, 7, 8,000 cemeteries in the state. And we're not
Wow.
a big
Wow.
state. Um,
Well, New
so
Jersey
anyway,
really isn't either, but they probably have a lot of burial grounds.
Mhm.
Being as
I'm learning that they do.
Yeah, I was like, being as old of a state as it is, I'm sure there's lots of burial grounds. And you have to think historically, before we had cemeteries, we did have sometimes the graveyards and the churchyards, but a lot of people buried on their own properties. Especially if they were in more rural areas, you buried your family where you lived. And over time, they may not have even marked the graves originally, but over time, a lot of times, whatever markers they may have used, if they weren't actual headstones, long gone with weather and time and everything. So I think then
Those
when,
are the worst.
yeah, because you just don't, you just all of a sudden you're like, oh my gosh, I have bodies on my property and I
My
had no
backyard.
idea.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And most states still allow family cemeteries. I know we do here. And, our regulatory agency, the State Cemetery Board, tries really, really, really hard to dissuade people from doing that. And it's not because, the government agency is trying to give money to the cemetery
Right.
industry. It's because try as you might, you will lose that cemetery at some point.
Right.
And it will, what you hoped would be a nice gesture of staying on your land will later become, a backhoe finding you and probably you getting moved. And that's
Yeah.
not probably not what you wanted in the first place.
Probably not. And sometimes figuring out who you are at that point, if it's 200 or 300 years later, we may not be able to figure out who you were.
That's
So
right.
I know, especially along the East Coast, though, I know they run into that a lot because there were a lot of those types of burials that took place. And again, for those time periods, made complete sense. They didn't have the technologies that we have for body disposal now, and they had to put them somewhere. So I get it.
I mean, we had one that came up just a few miles from my house several years ago. It was a single burial on a piece of private property, and the developer wanted to build a neighborhood. And it was just one. It really strange.
Yeah.
And the grave was intact, so there was no meaningful reason to open it and figure out who. There was no grave marker, nothing. The developer paid to move it, just whole, put it on a truck and move it to a nearby cemetery, but it's still an unknown. So yeah, that identity gets lost even in the best of conditions. In that case, it wasn't an unmarked cemetery. They were there. You could see them. It was a big above ground tomb. No clue who they were.
Hmm.
That's kind of sad in a way, just because
very
we're
sad.
like, this person's completely forgotten
Yeah.
because it wasn't marked in any way, like with any information, and there was no other documentation to go back to and say, okay, this is John Jones, or whatever.
Mhm.
This leads into a question that says, I live in an area that has a large Amish population, and I wonder if that contributes to the amount of small old cemeteries. This lecture also, they said, I like this. This lecture also taught me about the existence of state cemetery boards so that the next time I come across one of these cemeteries in my travels, I know how to learn a bit more about them.
There you go. And that is true. I mean, those government agencies exist in almost every state. You guys in Colorado, you're not big on regulation.
No, we're not.
No.
Yeah. Yeah, Colorado is one of the consistent, well, in Colorado, they don't have one of these.
We're not saying it's not
So,
necessary. We just know we don't have it.
yep, that's it. But yeah, most states do, and they are a wealth of information. Now, they're not generally historic minded. They are there to regulate the death care industry, but usually they can point you in the direction of people that do have information, and they'll have some minimal information on cemeteries. But
Right.
to go back to the first part of the question about the Amish burials, and is that connected to the existence of small family burial grounds? And the answer is no more than anywhere else. Family burial grounds are the number one type of burial ground in the country by far. And it really cuts across cultures, religions, the whole bit. They're just everywhere. So you'd expect to find them in Amish country just as much as in Colorado. Because I mean, you guys can, have plenty of ranch cemeteries and pioneer cemeteries and things like that. So it's the same kind of thing. So they're everywhere.
Yeah, that was one of the things I learned. This was years ago, I was trying to research cemeteries up near our Estes Park area because, big tourist site. There aren't any cemeteries up there. All of that is private burials on private properties in that area, with the exception of one church. And they don't do full body burials. It's cremains only in their like little backyard area. But yeah, I was like,
Scattering garden was the word you were looking for.
yes. And that's all I mean, it's not anything big. I've seen it. I actually have photographs of it. It's a lovely little place to go visit and contemplate. And there's nice little plaques for, the different people that have been scattered
cool.
there and whatever. But it's not a full cemetery as we think of cemeteries. And yeah, when I was looking, I was like, there's nothing in us because Estes Park was established quite a while ago, but they never established an actual cemetery up there. And so I was like, oh, guess I won't be visiting that one because the rest of them are all on private properties. And unless I know the people, I'm not going to go barging in on their personal cemeteries.
That's a real thing.
So I'm looking at some of these, and there was a question that was really interesting. Actually, there's a couple that are really interesting. The Sunken Military Craft Act.
Hmm.
Then the question was regarding the Sunken Military Craft Act. If private space or an aircraft carrying people ends up sinking, as it would be in a non-military craft, would the owner of the organization that built it be responsible for the collection of remains, or would anyone need to assume responsibility outside the ethical obligation to do so?
That's the first half of that question, by the way.
I know. I
Yeah,
was
and
looking at it. That
yeah, so it
one
was like I figured that was
is,
like almost two questions. So
it's an
So,
ambitious question. It's an ambitious series of questions.
yeah. So
I'm
start
sorry,
with
Jenny, to cut
actually,
you off.
what is the Sunken Military Craft Act
Okay.
for any of our listeners who may not know?
So the Sunken Military Craft Act was passed in 2004 by Congress. And it was by and large created as an equitable statute. So we as a country recognized, hey, we've got a lot of military vessels that have sunken in other countries' sovereign waters. And so the Sunken Military Craft Act asserts U.S. sovereignty over those locations as grave sites.
Mm,
And the point, and the reason I said that it was kind of an equitable thing, is that by doing that, we also agreed to protect the sovereign military vessels of those within our waters, other countries,
mm,
with the idea that, hey, we'll protect yours if you will protect ours in your waters. And it's interesting that, the student mentioned spacecraft because that's explicitly identified in the law. Um, and at the time, still, there are only three pieces of space hardware that have people
yeah.
that are in, water environments. One of them was the Challenger, and Challenger still has stuff wash up every now and then. The Columbia, when it broke up over Texas, did have some pieces land in water environments. Neither of those were what it was created for. It was created because of Gus Grissom's capsule, the second Mercury astronaut. He didn't die in that one. He died in Apollo 1. But when his Mercury capsule splashed down, a fair amount of debate over what happened, but ultimately it sunk in the ocean. He was rescued. And since then, that has been recovered and is in conservation for ultimate display now.
mm,
But it hadn't been recovered back then. So that was part of the reason.
Hmm.
Included spacecraft. But the question then goes on to the non-military craft, and that is something. There's nothing out there that covers this. And matter of fact, in 2 months, I'm going to Detroit to speak on the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald and
oh
that
wow.
site as a grave site for the 50th anniversary of the sinking. And, the Sunken Military Craft Act becomes kind of an interesting example of how we got really close and then didn't protect
We
those
do
sites
that a
because
lot.
that was a civilian vessel. And it absolutely became the grave of those who were on board. But it doesn't fit the definition of cemeteries.
Mhm.
It doesn't fit the military uses. And so it is a non-military craft, and the question is who's responsible?
Hmm.
And the answer is no idea, because there is no directive in the law for anybody to go retrieve that. And the Edmund Fitzgerald for many, many years, even though it sunk in 1975, what happened to it was a mystery, and it was a
Right.
mystery because the thing was so damn deep. Once it was ultimately discovered, there was a there were agreements for it to be left the hell alone. And the only thing that was recovered, I think, was its bell. Um,
Yeah.
but that, again, that was in consultation with the descendants
Right.
of the family members or of the folks who were on the boat. But that's just a recognition that there isn't a law really that applies in a death context to those sites that are not military. The only other closest thing that we have at the federal level is the Abandoned Shipwrecks Act of 1987, which is Congress handing over control of sunken vessels in federal waters and state waters to the states to regulate. But they're not covered as cemeteries, they're not covered as grave sites. And so that one becomes a real battle. And this happens a lot on the Great Lakes. That one becomes a real battle between conservation, documentation, and sport divers who some will just go visit and some will take stuff. Um, and so the same principles that would apply in a cemetery context on land don't apply there. And it's a lot harder to regulate, but at the same time, too, there's nothing that says you got to go get them. And so with the Edmund Fitzgerald, they were effectively buried at sea. Same with the Titanic. And then, the same went for the recent submersible that imploded on its way to
Yeah.
the Titanic. It was a private company. They were in international waters. There was no obligation to go retrieve the remains if they existed.
Right.
So
Right.
yeah, that context becomes really murky, for lack of a better way of putting it, really fast, because for those of you in the West, it is the wild, wild West of gravesite protection is underwater. And what is the law that applies? Sometimes there isn't any.
Yeah.
That's
Well, and
scary to
it's so
think.
much harder to retrieve in some cases, especially remains, because it is in the water, which creates an entirely different scenario of how do we even get to, sometimes you just can't, it goes too deep.
Right.
Or in the case of the Titanic, it was very cold water and we didn't have the technology then, especially to just send people in after those remains.
And water does funny things to
Yeah.
dead people. So, it's not as though any visits to the Titanic have found any humans. I mean, sometimes water does wonderful things for preservation, and other times it doesn't, especially when there are critters involved,
True.
because critters will
Yeah.
eat things. Um, so yeah, it's underwater is a really bizarre situation because you're now seeing with sea level rise, you're seeing what would otherwise be cemeteries on land that are now becoming submerged sites,
Right.
and they're eroding from or subsiding from private land. There's a site near me here it's just a Cajun burial ground from the 19th century, but it's now probably by now fully underwater.
Oh, wow.
And when into a navigable waterway, a channel that's actually used for commercial purposes. And in that case, then the ownership of the land transfers. It's not private anymore. It becomes part of the navigable waterway. It becomes the state's, so it's public land. Now you got a cemetery on public land, and boats are hitting stuff. It's and yeah, so it creates a whole new layer of bizarre when you go underwater.
And trying to figure out the legislation for all of that becomes,
Mhm.
I'm
It
sure.
makes my brain hurt.
And anybody else who's sitting there trying to figure out how do we regulate this, if we regulate this and make up the rules, and then how do you enforce some of it? Because like you
That's
said,
the
there's
part
Well,
of enforcing it. What do you do
well,
to,
yeah, and but back to this whole point about who's responsible. I mean, this one cemetery that has just eroded into the water, landowner's responsible. Well, the landowner's the government. Okay, good. Government can do something about it. Too expensive, too difficult. It's not a reasonable use of resources, and so that cemetery is just slowly disappearing. And it's not through, because we would get calls because that one happens to be within sight of a very well-trafficked bridge. And so we would get calls when I worked for the state. Why aren't you guys doing something with this? Really? These are your standard big New Orleans above ground tombs. What do you think that the government is going to do? But
Yeah,
I
who's
get
going to foot
it.
the bill for that too? Because that
Well,
would
that's what it
be
comes down to. It's a cost issue.
expensive.
Um, so yeah, so Diane, you were getting at the other part of the question. Um, what if the craft were carrying human material, such as the recent failed spaceflight carrying human DNA? Would the tissue in this instance or in general be considered human remains if the individual it belonged to is deceased, or would it fall into a different category? This student blew my mind.
I The whole question blew my mind. It made me think of things I hadn't even considered before. So
That one has got so many layers and so much complexity to it. And I'd like to think that the student really engineered it that way, but I think they just had some curiosity about something and created this extremely complex question.
love
If
it.
the spacecraft were carrying human DNA and the person was alive, well, I don't know that it's remains. But if they were dead, is it remains? I don't know. You get at this question, and on some level, it becomes a philosophical question. What's a person? Um, and you know, but I can say that in that context, it wouldn't fit the definition of any cemetery. Um, and it wouldn't fit the definition of probably a military craft because these are private
Mhm.
rockets. So the question then is, where did it land? And if it landed within state waters, which by and large is 3 nautical miles from shore, all the way around the country, unless you live in Texas or Florida. And that's a whole lengthy other discussion. Um, then the government owns what becomes embedded in those bottoms, unless the actual owner, SpaceX or what have you, goes and retrieves it, and they can. But then it's a government thing, and I'm fairly sure that no state government in the country has the wherewithal to go recover um, a rocket from continental
Probably not.
shelf. Um, so yeah, I mean, like I said, complex as hell question. One that I could probably write 3 or 4 law articles about. I probably
Wow.
need to get in touch with that student and thank them.
Pick their brain a little more and be like, what even? Yeah, it just like I said when I first read that one, I was like, I never even the whole DNA part of it. I was like,
Mhm.
I know that never even crossed my mind. Is do we consider that something that would be a cemetery then? And like you said, the state government's probably not going to retrieve that stuff. They don't have most of them. I'm assuming do not have the financial or even the labor resources to do that kind of thing without assistance from the federal government, and none of them have, as sad as and crass as this sounds, they don't have the time to worry about that with everything else that they're worried about and taking care of on a regular basis. Like that's just the reality of how governments
Yeah,
work.
that is the reality of how governments work.
I mean, we don't want to think of it that way because it sounds like they don't really care then, but I don't know. Although burial at sea, I'm okay with that. Like if I go down in a plane or a boat and I'm down at the bottom of the sea, you can leave me there. I'm okay with that. It's fine. If I become fish food, that's okay too.
Yep, agreed.
This was a question I thought was interesting. Um, is there or are there any specific reasons why animals and pets are not allowed to be buried with human remains? And this is important to a lot of people because they love their pets, and we
Right.
have a lot of
Yes.
pets in our lives. So this person also said, I'm assuming this doesn't apply to family cemeteries, obviously, where you can make your own rules. But if a cemetery is privately owned, can the owner of the property allow pets to be buried with owners? I asked this with the assumption that the owner has passed away first and then their pet passes away naturally. And would the family be able to bury the pet with the owner in their plot or next to their plot? There was a lot going on in that question.
Yeah, a lot going on. And, the interesting thing is, from a legal perspective, that's cutting edge stuff. There are not many states right now in the US that allow for pets to be lawfully buried with their people. Whether they're buried, it's cremated remains, anything. Um,
Which is why we have the pet
and
cemeteries.
which is why there are pet cemeteries. And I worked on several iterations of Louisiana's pet burial law over the years until it finally got passed. And so now we are one of the states, but one of very few that allows the co-burial of pets and people. And that even applies to family cemeteries. So you'd think, yeah, family cemetery, you own it, you make your rules. Mm-mm.
Hmm.
No, the law. Now, does that mean people aren't doing it? Of course it doesn't.
Right.
People are doing it. Um, but the law says that almost consistently around the country, the law says that a cemetery is for the interment of the human dead. And it's right there that you get at a single word that makes a universe of difference. And by and large, I think my answer to this student was it was religious pushback that kept animals out of human cemeteries, and in most states still does. This idea that this is consecrated ground, questions of whether these creatures have souls, and are they is it appropriate for them to be buried in consecrated ground? And that became a situation where you're right. We are a pet loving culture, and we want those critters to be with us. But even here in Louisiana now, even though it is lawful, you can't just go into an existing cemetery and inter a pet. There has to be a whole new section of the cemetery created because everybody that was buried before the change in the law had an expectation that they were not going to be buried with animals. Um,
Wow.
and so interestingly, it really wasn't. It was more of a religious pushback. It wasn't the funeral industry, though. I will say that the funeral industry was a little concerned about things like horses, because they're
I can
large.
understand.
But I mean, from my perspective, I was like, guys, what are y'all complaining about? You can charge more for your space. But the threshold requirement here is that the pet has to be cremated. And so the answer to the second part, well, the answer to the first part of it is most states don't allow it. For those that do, they, I think, almost consistently have to be cremated. And they can only be buried in certain sections that are designated for pet burial. Well, pet and human burial. But then the other part of the question that talks about what do you do when the pet's death is out of sync with the human's death? When we first worked on the pet burial bill here, I had inserted a provision that said basically, thou shalt not euthanize. You couldn't put down pets to be buried with people. Seemed
Good,
like a really, yeah,
good idea.
seemed like a good idea. It actually came out in later versions of the bill, because what people had pointed out, and I had no reason to know this, was veterinarians are under a legal obligation not to do that already. So the people
Okay.
that would, have the capacity to do it were already prohibited from doing it, so it was superfluous. So the answer is no, you can't have your pets killed to be buried with you. So in the
I'm laughing at Diane's reaction to this
oh, I
whole
was too.
conversation. Sorry,
I was
Diane.
too. Um,
For our
so in
listeners who
the
aren't on YouTube, she's like just in shock that anybody would even consider that particular
oh,
act.
Yeah.
and we were, when we were drafting it the first time, this is probably like 2008, 2009, and I don't think it finally passed until 16 or 17. We that was a big concern. It was we can't have people killing their pets for burial. This is, because you can just see people will do weird things.
True.
So anyway, so they're not allowed to do that. And so, if the here today in the sections where there are pet burials, if the pet dies first, those cremated remains can go into the space. That's up to the cemetery that's established the human pet section and what their rules say. If the person dies first, it's probably the cemetery will be happy to take your money to put the cremated remains of your pet in next to you after you die when the pet dies. Whether they can dig you up to put the cremated remains in the casket with you, that is probably going to be a combination of explicit provision in a will and still going to be something, whether the funeral home is going to want to deal with that. The cemetery
Or
is going to deal
even the
with that.
cemetery, because the cemetery would have their own rules for basically a disinterment.
Absolutely. And so that's a fair point. There is, too, in every state, a fallback law regulating disinterment. And those laws have not been amended to account for that scenario. So probably they would have to go, in a little space next to you.
That's what I would
I mean,
assume.
I would hope so.
my situation is going to be complex. I mean, um, all of those top two shelves there, those are cremated pets. So yeah, they're going to be more pet remains in my space than human. Um,
That's why you
so
get an urn vault.
well, yeah, they're going to need a few of them. Um,
Well,
so
just whatever. But yeah. Okay, we'll do one more question.
okay,
This was the other one of the military related ones I wanted to get to. I think we may have sort of covered this a while ago, but it's been a long time. But one of the questions is, this one might have a long answer, so feel free to shorten it as much as you want, Ryan. But why isn't the grave of the unknown soldier an empty casket or coffin? In the section of the book we read, when he talks about Poole, the author, when he talks about the process of selecting the unknown soldier, it shows the challenges with choosing a person to represent him. That person was known even when they couldn't find their name. They were all known. I think we answered this question when we talked specifically about the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, when we had Ruth on, who's one of the tomb guards, and we talked about some of this before. So anyway, why isn't it an empty casket or coffin?
yeah. So two parts there. To one of them, the latter piece, that it gets a little muddled, the question, but they were making some comment that person was known, and yes, they were born as a known individual, but what was collected from the battlefield under the technology of the time was impossible to be known.
Right.
So they were a true unknown, and that was something that, and we talked about this, I think, on an earlier episode too, was something that those who were making the selection went to extreme lengths to do. But why isn't it an empty casket? Why isn't it just a symbolic place? There was a feeling, and this is not limited to the United States, the same exists in a lot of countries, and we weren't the first.
Right.
The thinking was that one unknown individual, one unidentifiable individual, would serve as the proxy for all of the unknown soldiers from that particular war. And I've read several accounts of it, and the thinking was that if a family who had not gotten remains back, or who had not been given a grave location, in this case it was World War One in Europe, but were simply told missing, killed in action, what have you, the thinking was that if those families visited the unknown soldier's grave in Arlington, it could just as easily be their son. In this case, it was definitely male. It could
Right.
just as easily have been their son as anybody else's. And so the anonymity of it and the fact that there was a body there um, really gave it that additional power to convey to people, we did our best, we tried, and symbolically, this is your son, for all you know, and that's
Mhm.
true. So I think it had to be somebody had to go in there. An empty casket just wouldn't have accomplished that goal. Was that goal right? I have no idea. I like it.
I like it.
But
Yeah.
I like
yeah.
it too. And it again, it speaks back historically to a time like now, today, when our soldiers go to war, we have far more ways of keeping track of them and also identifying them when something does happen than we used to. When we had, all the previous wars leading up to World War II, or probably even the Korean War, there were a lot of times where we just couldn't identify. Like we knew people had gone over there and they, like you said, they didn't come back. So to be able to give families some kind of a peace of mind that maybe we brought their son back or their husband back or whomever, we just couldn't tell you who they were, but at least maybe it gave
Something.
them
Yeah.
something. And the fact that we still honor them today, there's still the guard that is there 24/7. And I think that even though today, like I said, in a modern standpoint, we know who they are now when something happens, and we're able to notify families sooner and we're able to do something. But I think
It wasn't an option back
yeah,
then. And you're right.
Right.
It went through Korea, was probably the last American conflict where that will be the case, that there were unidentifiables. And, there was an unidentified Vietnam
yes,
soldier as well, but he's not there anymore. And that one is empty, because he was identified, and the consensus was Korea is the last one that we could not do identifications for, so the Vietnam one will stay empty.
yeah. And like I said, fortunately going forward,
Yeah.
unfortunately, because I don't like the fact that we still have to
Right.
fight wars, but
But
like at least we can do something. And just we had to do something before that. And I will be forever grateful that we have some way to recognize those
Yeah,
guys that never, I want to say men, a lot of them were boys that never came
yeah,
home in any way,
sure.
and they completely lost over there. So, yeah. And I think maybe, and I know your students' ages probably range a little bit because of the online version of your courses, but I know too sometimes with our younger generations, because we've never experienced war in this way, like the idea of the physical body like that. I
Mhm.
don't know if that resonates with them the same way that it would have resonated. Whereas the symbology of the empty tomb is fine for them, but I don't know if they
Yeah,
understand.
that's a good observation. I think you're probably right about that.
Yeah. Not that I have experienced a whole big war or anything either,
Yeah.
but I'm
but
just
we grew up closer to those wars.
right.
Yeah.
And the people who fought in them,
Mhm.
grandparents and such. So I think it does, again, it becomes this historical element where it's not as real in their mind because they're so far removed from what was happening at the time that it's just the thing they read about now or they hear about from their professors or their high school teachers or whomever. It doesn't
Yep.
always have that same connection that we sometimes older people like to make when we're old. But well, Ryan, thank you once again. I always love when you send these questions.
I
I love
know.
reading them just to see what your students are thinking because
It never ceases to be entertaining. And, we just 2 days ago, the midterm opened for the current term. So we're halfway through that one. You'll get a new list in a few weeks.
Oh,
yay. Yeah, this always exciting. I love, like I said, I love seeing especially some of them. Like today, we had some that have never come up at all in all the ones that we've done so far, and I was just blown away by some of the thought processes. And then you're going, what was going through that person's mind when they decided to think that far into something?
mhm.
Not that it's not important. It's just we just don't even think about some of this stuff until somebody like that brings it up. So
Yeah.
Yeah.
thank you to
Impressive
your
depth.
students. Yeah,
My pleasure. And and I will note that they have I make them listen to the prior podcasts, and I am getting rave reviews about the podcasts.
thanks.
So
Well, thank you to your
apparently
students.
they are enjoying them. So
Oh, good. Good. We like that they're enjoying it. And
Yeah.
And hopefully it's helping you out too, so that they are thinking beyond. I'm hoping that in some cases they might expand on some of the things we've covered for you and make you have to work a little harder to
They
answer
do.
their question, which I love. So
Yep.
we will see you in a few more weeks then.
Few weeks.
Thanks,
Sounds
Ryan.
good.
Take care.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you for joining us today. To learn more about today's episode, visit our website, theordinaryextraordinarycemetery.com, where you'll find additional links in our show notes. If you're watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe to our channel. And if you enjoyed this or any of our episodes, consider leaving a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube. Your support helps others find our show and discover all of our ordinary, extraordinary stories.
You can also follow us on social media for cemetery facts, photos, quotes, and more. We are on Facebook and Instagram at Ordinary Extraordinary Cemetery. If you'd like to help support us financially, you can donate a cup of coffee by clicking on the coffee cup icon on our website or YouTube, or purchase some of our fabulous Ordinary Extraordinary Cemetery merchandise through our store link.
Until we meet again.